So tonight I want to speak about anxiety. I was stimulated to do so by Ryan McConnell, one of the viewers of my YouTube channel videos, and he asked me about anxiety, and I found myself unable to recommend an up-to-date text that I think can do justice to the topic, and then he suggested that perhaps I had some thoughts of my own that could go into a video, so here we are. I do a lot of supervision of beginning therapists and consultations with more experienced therapists, and in recent years I've noticed that a good many, when they encounter anxiety states in their patients, panic attacks, they seem so ready to see such anxiety, such panic as fear, and as probably echoing rather directly some kind of trauma, that it seldom occurs to them that these anxiety states may be in the face of other threatening emotions, very unwanted emotions, such as anger and rage. Many of the people who come to me initially complaining about anxiety, it becomes clear pretty quickly that they're very, very angry. They don't want to know about their anger. They're very frightened by their anger. It seems that they have not overcome the infantile equation of thoughts with deeds, so they're afraid that if they allow themselves to become aware of their anger and allow it to come into their mind, somehow people around them will be dropping like flies. It reminds me of that Stephen King novel in which every time she gets angry, the curtains catch on fire. Some people seem to not really grasp that fantasies and feelings and emotions are merely the contents of the mind, and that they do not have the magical power to effect homicide. And therefore, being so afraid of their feelings for these reasons, they feel there's little alternative but to bottle them up, repress them, and then of course Freud's basic discovery is that the repressed returns in disguised forms. And I believe that it often returns, repressed anger often returns in the form of anxiety attacks. It's as if the person feels that their anger is coming very close to the surface, that a volcano may be close to erupting, and they're terrified in the face of this threatening eruption. But a lot of therapists don't seem to get this. They seem to think that anxious people are traumatized people, and they may well have been, but I think a lot of therapists forget that when we are traumatized, we often, or I would suggest on some level always, react with rage. It's extremely angering to be traumatized, highly frustrating. Frustration generally leads to aggression. One group of psychologists called this the frustration-aggression hypothesis. I don't think it's a hypothesis. I think frustration trauma produces anger. And so traumatized people are often angry people, but they're often people who don't want to be angry, who don't want to know that they're angry, and when their anger is close to erupting, they have a panic attack. Now, I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying all panic attacks boil down to this, but I think this is often a part of the picture that a lot of therapists are not sufficiently alert to. So, okay, we need to talk about anxiety. And I guess we should start with Freud's early ideas about anxiety. His first theory of anxiety has been called the toxicological theory of anxiety, in which repressed libido, frustrated sexuality, leads to a damming up of the libido, and the dammed up libido being the energy of the sexual drive, the dammed up libido kind of breaks down like wine turns into vinegar. The dammed up libido breaks down and turns into anxiety. So anxiety then in this early theory is a sign of frustrated sexuality. It's an idea that was very linked to Freud's notion of the so-called actual neurosis, which he distinguished from the psychoneurosis. The symptoms of the actual neurosis he thought of were direct consequences of frustrating sexual practices. These symptoms were not psychoneurotic. They did not indicate psychic conflict. They were almost direct physiological consequences of incomplete or inadequate sexual discharge. And we know that in his personal sex life, Freud had already had as many or more children than he wanted, and had withdrawn from a good deal of sexuality with his wife out of a fear of impregnating her. Contraception was inadequate. Contraception was frustrating. So in this way, Freud is accounting for his own anxiety symptoms, which he does not want to see as psychoneurotic, so he attributes them to direct frustration, the so-called actual neurosis. Problem was that no one else could find evidence of the existence of this so-called actual neurosis, and the concept kind of fell by the wayside. But one can see the concept as a result of Freud's own resistance to seeing his own neurosis. It took him quite a number of years to get past this early toxicological theory of anxiety as a direct result of dammed up sexual libido. But by 1926, in Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, he finally explicitly rejects this theory and reverses himself. Up until 1926, he had thought that repression causes anxiety, and now he says, well, I got it backwards. Anxiety causes repression. Okay, he then goes on to distinguish two types of anxiety: traumatic anxiety, which he also calls automatic anxiety on the one hand, and signal anxiety on the other. Traumatic or automatic anxiety is what happens in trauma when a person is overwhelmed and feels helpless in the face of some situation. And it's this core feeling of helplessness and of being overwhelmed that generates traumatic or automatic anxiety. He cites as an example, not as a cause, but as an example, the birth trauma, in which the infant is helpless and overwhelmed and goes through this what must be an overwhelming experience of moving through the birth canal and coming out into a cold and bright environment and having to take that first breath. And so this is the trauma of birth, and it's the prototype, Freud says, not the cause, but the prototype of all subsequent anxiety situations. Otto Rank, of course, goes much further and says it's not just the prototype, but it's the root cause of later anxiety. Freud does not agree with this, and he doesn't agree with Rank's attempt to come up with a briefer therapy by cutting the chase and going right back to the birth trauma. Freud comes up with a brilliant analogy to refute Rank's theory. He says Rank's theory is analogous to the situation in which an 8-story building is now in flame because an oil lamp was turned over in the basement. And in Rank's theory, it's as if all the fireman has to do is go in and retrieve the overturned oil lamp and everything will be well. But the point is that the whole building and all of the upper stories are now in flames, so to simply go to the root cause, the overturned oil lamp, isn't going to accomplish anything. Vivid metaphor, and quite an illuminating one. Okay, so the trauma of birth is not the cause of later neurosis, but it is the prototype of all later anxiety states. One is overwhelmed. So that's traumatic or automatic anxiety, and all of us have experiences of this because even with the most devoted mother in the world, or I should say primary caretaker, doesn't have to be the mother, it could be the father. The gender of the primary caretaker doesn't matter. But no primary caretaker can be perfect. There will be frustrating delays. The infant has no sense of time, so a minute can seem like an hour or a day. And the hungry baby, the baby who's overheated or underheated, is helpless to solve these problems, helpless to feed himself, dependent, must wait. None of us avoid this kind of trauma to a lesser or to a greater degree. And in the face of this kind of trauma, anxiety is generated, traumatic or automatic anxiety. But with the early development of the ego, the infant is able to learn how to anticipate situations where this overwhelming traumatic situation of helplessness may occur. The infant becomes capable of anticipating situations where he may encounter this kind of trauma. So as soon as mother starts to leave the room, and just as she's about to go out the door, he senses, oh, this is a situation in which I'm left alone, and it's in this kind of situation that I can be overwhelmed. And so he generates signal anxiety. Mother leaving signals danger. This is a danger situation. And in the face of the signal anxiety, which is a small amount of anxiety, that's warning against the much larger quantity of anxiety should the trauma occur, the infant begins to defend itself by crying in an attempt to bring mother back into the room. So signal anxiety is based on anticipation. It's an attempt to avoid trauma by generating a small amount of anxiety, which serves as a signal to institute defensive maneuvers to avoid the much larger amount of anxiety that comes with trauma. Okay, so now we have the distinction between signal and traumatic anxiety. Freud proceeds to enumerate a series of danger situations, or what Charles Brenner called the catastrophes of childhood. The ego can now anticipate, and when it anticipates a danger situation, it generates signal anxiety, which then generates defensive activity. And so what are the series of dangers? Roughly in the first year of life, Freud says the danger is the loss of the object. In Kleinian terms, this would mean the loss of the part object, the good part object, the loss of the breast mother. This would essentially mean death, because, I mean, if an infant loses the primary caretaker, it may die. So this is a pretty disastrous situation. The loss of the object, the part object, nurturer. In the second year of life, the infant's mind has evolved to the point where it is perceiving the mother not simply as a feeding breast, not just as a feeding thing, but as a person, and whose love is crucial, and therefore mother acquires the power to train the child, because the child wants to maintain her smile and not have it replaced by a frown. So here the danger is the loss of the object's love, not just the loss of the object, but the loss of the object's love. As we move into the third year of life, the danger becomes what Freud calls castration, loss of, for Freud, the penis, but here I become Lacanian, loss of the phallus. The phallus is the symbolic penis. It represents my capacity to obtain or attract the love and attention of my love object. The phallus is that quality of mine, that capacity of mine to make myself desired or desirable to the object of my desire. And therefore the phallus is not the literal penis, but it symbolizes that which mother wants, that which mother desires, and that which I'm able to supply. And I fear the loss of what I have that makes me desirable to my desired other. So that fear Freud calls castration anxiety. And then towards the end of the Oedipal phase, with the formation of the superego, in which the child's aggression towards the Oedipal rival is turned on self. That is what the superego is, aggression turned away from the object back against the self. And now that I've got a superego, which represents aggression turned on myself, I now have fear of the superego, the fourth danger situation, the fear of a superego attack. For Freud, the later dangers really collapse back into the earlier ones. Beneath the fear of the superego is the fear of castration. Beneath the fear of castration is the fear of the loss of the object's love, and beneath the fear of loss of the object's love is fear of the loss of the object. which is about as close as Freud comes to positing anything like a primary death anxiety, for loss of the object would be tantamount to death. So here we have a series of danger situations, and whenever in later life I'm in some situation which confronts me with any one of these dangers, anxiety is generated, signal anxiety is generated, so that I can begin to take steps to prevent the regressive collapse. So my superego perks up and tells me that I better do something, and if I don't do it in time, then I'm kind of threatened with castration, and then if I still don't successfully defend myself, I may be faced with loss of the object's love, and then ultimately I may be faced with loss of the object. So in a whole range of situations in adult life, these anxieties are stimulated, and defensive steps are taken, more or less successfully. The thing to notice about Freud's sequence of danger situations is that they all concern the loss of something good. The loss of the part object, breast, the loss of the mother's love, the loss of the phallus, the loss of the superego's love. Loss, 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 loss. It's always absence. The danger for Freud is always absence of something good. It's never the presence of something bad and attacking and persecutory. This is because Freud, I believe, never was able to overcome his idealization of the mother. I mean, in one place he incredibly says that all human relations that reach any depth are characterized by ambivalence, by both love and hate, except, he says, perhaps for the relationship of a mother and her son, which is laughable, of course. He had a blind spot. Deborah Margolis wrote a book called Freud and His Mother, and explains that probably Freud was never able to accept his repressed hatred for his narcissistic mother. In any case, he kept the mother on a pedestal. He kept the early mother as a good object. There are exceptions to this. There is the head of the Medusa. There is the theme of the three caskets. Occasionally, the frightening phallic mother appears in Freud's thought. But to a very large extent, the mother is kept as an idealized figure, a target of Oedipal desire, but not very often seen as a persecutor. It was Carl Abraham who, through his studies of the paintings of an Italian painter by the name of Segantini, whose hatred of the mother is very evident in his paintings, Abraham, through the study of Segantini, was able to recognize the bad mother, the persecutory mother, and of course Abraham's analysand was Melanie Klein, who brings in the persecutory mother, the mother experienced as persecutory, whether she really is or not. And in Klein, both of these possibilities are there, although many people try to say that Klein basically denied the real bad mother in favor of the child's fantasy of a bad mother. I don't believe that's true. I think they're both there in Klein. But in any case, Abraham and Klein really add to Freud's sequence of danger situations. In addition to loss of the good, there is the threatening, persecutory presence of the bad part object. Melanie Klein brings that in. This is not the place to go into a more detailed study of the theory of the Oedipus complex. In my review so far, I recognize that I've been speaking about all of this mostly from the standpoint of the male child. I've done this not because of any particular sexist bias, but simply because to study the differences between the female situation and the male situation in this area is very complex. I mean, Freud puzzled about this throughout the 1920s in a whole series of papers, realizing that there is no simple equivalence and no simple reversal of these situations. Both little boys and little girls both fall in love with the mother, who for the girl is a same-sex object, for the boy is an opposite-sex object. So these developments are very different for the two sexes, but this is not the place to get into all of these complexities, because I want to keep the focus on the subject of anxiety. So in the face of strong sexual urges, lustful urges, the ego can experience anxiety. Equally, in the face of strong aggressive urges coming up from the id, the ego can experience anxiety and can institute defenses against the sexual and the aggressive drives. So sometimes anxiety is in the face of the strength of our sexual and aggressive feelings and urges, which is what I said at the beginning. It's as if a lot of therapists these days have lost sight of this fact, and that when patients present with anxiety, instead of their anxiety being a direct reflection of trauma of some kind, the anxiety may actually be in the face of powerful feelings that are threatening to come up into consciousness, generating a great deal of anxiety, intense signal anxiety, in the form of anxiety attacks, which indicate the power of unwanted sexual desire or unwanted murderous feelings and fantasies. But the ego can also experience anxiety in the face of the superego, which is not, in my view, a conscience, but in fact an internal moral attacker, an internal hanging judge, harsh, judgmental, highly critical, with what Heinrich Racker called often a mania for reproaching. It loves to find you at fault and to morally reproach and attack you, and to beat you down in this way. And so the ego fears this kind of moralistic attack. It fears an attack by the superego, and it generates anxiety. If I don't do something quickly, if I don't change my ways quickly, I'm in danger of being morally assaulted and beaten down by the superego. And so that's, again, signal anxiety, this time not in the face of the drives, but in the face of the superego. And thirdly, the ego can experience anxiety in the face of reality. The rent is due, the income tax payment is due, but there's not enough money in the bank. One can now generate anxiety in the face of real demands, real dangers. But sometimes the anxiety generated in the face of reality is quite distorted. One is not necessarily seeing reality clearly. One may, in fact, be rather paranoid and greatly exaggerate the threat of attack from the outside. But whether reality is accurately perceived or perceived in a highly distorted way, in either case, the ego feels in danger and generates anxiety. So, if anxiety is in the face of the so-called instincts, we have instinctual anxiety. If anxiety is in the face of the superego, we have moral anxiety, although I would rather say pseudo-moral anxiety, because the superego is not essentially moral. It loves to catch you in wrongdoing, not because it really cares about morality, but because it loves to beat you. But okay, moral anxiety, it's governed by a pseudo-morality principle, I would say. The id is governed by a pleasure-pain principle, and reality, the ego, is guided hopefully by the reality principle in its assessments of reality, but it often assesses improperly and feels excessive anxiety in the face of reality. So here's the poor ego threatened on three fronts and generating anxiety as a signal as a result. Okay, when the ego generates anxiety, it institutes defense measures in order to avoid trauma. So defenses can be directed against all three fronts. Defenses against the id, sexual and aggressive drives of the id, in which case we have neurosis. When the ego is directing defenses against the superego, we often have impulse disorders of various kinds, antisocial personality disorders, addictions, because the defenses against the superego can often put the superego out of operation, allowing behavior that would otherwise be prevented. And when defenses against reality go too far, we're threatened by a breakdown of the ego's main function, which is reality testing. And the result can be psychosis, a breakdown in the reality testing function of the ego because defenses have been mobilized against a threatening reality, or at least a reality thought to be threatening or felt to be threatening. Okay, I guess this would be the place to turn to Melanie Klein and her important distinctions between two fundamentally different kinds of anxiety: persecutory anxiety on the one hand, and depressive or reparative anxiety on the other, and her related distinctions between persecutory guilt on the one hand and depressive or reparative guilt on the other. Persecutory anxiety belongs to the paranoid schizoid position, where everything is split, all good, all bad. That's what schizoid means in this context, split. And it's a paranoid position because the all good can be projected out or kept in and identified with. The all bad can be projected out or kept in and identified with. But the projection of these contents outwards onto others is an essential feature of the paranoid schizoid position. So in this position, life is a jungle, it's kill or be killed. One can experience oneself as prey, being hunted by predators. Here is where narcissism resides, because one doesn't have the luxury of caring very much about other people because one's priority is personal survival, hence the narcissism, the narcissistic self-preoccupation. And the kind of anxiety experienced here is anxiety in the face of the predator that is hunting you. This is persecutory anxiety. It's all about my survival in the face of real or imagined attackers. I mean, let's face it, sometimes the attackers are real. The paranoid Jews got out of Germany. Seems they weren't paranoid after all. Some people suffer from insufficient paranoia, and their reality testing is hampered as a result. Some people are over paranoid, some people are under paranoid. In any case, in the PS position, anxiety is of a persecutory and therefore of a narcissistic sort. As we move into the depressive, or what I prefer to call the reparative position, the leading anxiety is depressive anxiety, which should not be confused with depression. A lot of people get Klein wrong here. She calls it the depressive position not because depression is there. It isn't. She calls it depressive because here is where depressive anxiety occurs. Now, what do we mean by depressive anxiety? We mean anxiety that my attacks on an object that I now see is not all bad but contains good, because as I move into the depressive position, I overcome splitting and I start to become aware of both sides now, and I see that the object that I thought was an all bad persecutor is also an object containing good, and I've been trying to kill the object thinking it's all bad. I now realize it's not all bad, and it seems that I may have been killing an object that is also good. Is there time to get this object, this person, to the emergency room? Is there time to save its life? Is there time to repair it and restore it to health? So depressive anxiety is anxiety in the face of my own destructiveness that may have gone and done great damage, and I'm urgently seeking to repair the damage that I may well have done in my paranoid schizoid blindness. Okay, this is depressive anxiety, which Donald Winnicott helpfully renamed the capacity for concern. As we move from PS into D, we acquire the capacity for concern. We move from part-object relations to whole-object relations. In Freud's terms, we achieve ambivalence. PS is pre-ambivalent. D is an ambivalent position, both sides now. And this leads to the capacity for concern for the object and attempts to make reparation for damage done. Okay, two very different types of anxiety here. Similarly, two very different types of guilt. In the paranoid schizoid position, we have persecutory guilt, in which I simply flagellate myself. Here's the narcissistic element. I'm not showing any concern for the person that I've attacked and who is bleeding in the corner. I simply have my cat o' nine tails out and I'm flagellating myself. I'm so bad, I'm awful. This type of guilt, persecutory guilt, is extremely narcissistic. It's of no use whatever to the person I've injured. But if I move into the depressive position, I become capable of depressive or reparative guilt, in which case I drop the cat o' nine tails and the self-flagellation, and I pick up my first aid kit and I get busy bandaging the other. Because in PS, we're all about ourselves. As we move into D, we discover the reality of the other and develop some degree of concern, caritas, towards the other. So two kinds of anxiety, two kinds of guilt. In my own writings over the last 10 years, I have associated the superego with persecutory anxiety and persecutory guilt, and I have associated the conscience with the capacity for concern and with depressive anxiety and reparative guilt. Conscience quite distinct from superego. Conscience reflecting concern for the other. Superego is about self-attack, self-flagellation. Okay. Conscience I see as arising from early experience with the nurturer who fed us and kept us alive. It's based on an identification with the nurturer. The superego, as Freud explained, is aggression turned against the self. Melanie Klein moved this process much earlier. I mean, Freud didn't see this happening until the end of the Oedipal phase. Klein moves it right into the first year of life. Very early on, we start turning aggression against ourselves and we identify with the aggressor. This is the early persecutory superego. Okay, having brought, well, just before leaving Klein, I want to say a word about the distinction between guilt and shame. Certainly with the rise of self-psychology in the 1970s and ever since, and there was for many decades in psychoanalysis, not so much among more classical Freudians and Kleinians, but certainly among self and relational and intersubjective analysts, there was a flight from guilt, there was a flight from the superego, and instead a great preoccupation with shame. Well, that's because in advanced consumer capitalism, as Christopher Lasch explained, we evolved a culture of narcissism. And narcissists suffer from shame, not guilt. They're not worried about the others. They're worried entirely about themselves. The only kind of anxiety they can really suffer is persecutory anxiety, not depressive reparative anxiety. And persecutory anxiety is, in my view, essentially indistinguishable from shame. In fact, in the paranoid schizoid position, persecutory guilt, I think, is also essentially indistinguishable from shame and from persecutory anxiety. I think all of these are overlapping concepts. Persecutory anxiety, persecutory guilt, shame, they all go together. Essentially one thing, I believe. Quite distinct from depressive anxiety, capacity for concern, reparative guilt. There's been a comeback in psychoanalysis over the last few years. A comeback in terms of a remembering, a rediscovery of the role of guilt and the role of the persecutory superego in psychopathology. Okay, moving on now to Soren Kierkegaard and the Existentialists. Both Kierkegaard, from his Christian perspective, Martin Buber, from his Jewish perspective, both of them remind us that not all anxiety is neurotic. They make a distinction between neurotic anxiety and existential anxiety, and they make a similar distinction between neurotic guilt and existential guilt. So let's start with anxiety. Freud has told us all about neurotic anxiety in the face of the drives, in the face of the superego, in the face of external reality. But in addition to all of this, there is what Kierkegaard calls existential anxiety, and that is the anxiety that is intrinsic to the human condition as such, that all human beings suffer from, defend against, or preferably learn how to bear. This is the anxiety of freedom. Both Kierkegaard and Buber are existentialists. They follow the essentially Abrahamic religions in their view of the human being as unlike all other creatures in being blessed and burdened with freedom. Freedom which can be such a burden that we seek to escape from it. In the words of the classic by Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre takes a similar position as an existentialist. It's not so much that we ought to be free. For Sartre, we are free and we can't stand it, and we want to escape from it, and we want to lay down our burden of freedom at the feet of various dictators or gurus who will tell us what to do. In my recent video lecture on spirituality, I pointed to a very widespread and common abuse of Eastern thought and of meditation to try to escape from the burden of freedom, of having to make decisions and having to agonize about decisions, as if this part of our experience could be transcended by the use of meditative techniques, which will remove this burden from us. This is a great illusion and essentially a destructive path. We suffer existential anxiety because we're free and because we have to make distinctions between what is good, for example, and what is evil, which way to go. So existentialist literature is all about this. And I mean, if we seek to escape the anxiety of freedom, we wind up, in the words of Jean-Paul Sartre, embracing a life of bad faith. If we retreat from the anxiety of freedom, for Kierkegaard, we end up living what he calls a shut-in life. In fact, for Kierkegaard, our attempts to escape from existential freedom and anxiety have the end result of generating neurotic anxiety. A great deal of our neurotic anxiety arises from our unwillingness to face existential anxiety. It's interesting that the Kleinian psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion ends up saying something very similar. I mean, he says early on people make a decision either to face and learn how to bear pain or to escape from it. And most psychopathology derives from the decision to seek to escape from mental pain rather than learning how to bear it. This is essentially similar to Kierkegaard's position. Kierkegaard says what we have to do in the face of the anxiety of freedom is bear that anxiety and move ahead and make decisions and move into life despite our anxiety. The escapes from it lead to neurosis. Okay, similarly with the subject of guilt, there is neurotic guilt, and psychoanalysis is pretty good on all of this. This is guilt that we suffer for crimes that we didn't really commit, that we imagine we have committed. There's an omnipotent magical element in all of this. We're prosecuting ourselves for crimes of which we're innocent. And then, of course, there is the excessive flagellation of ourselves for crimes which we may, in fact, have committed. So part of psychoanalytic work with neurotics is trying to sort out, how much of this guilt is irrational and how much of it is in fact justified, and what's being done about this guilt. Is this guilt being managed destructively or creatively? So there is neurotic guilt, but then there is also genuine guilt. The guilt that is also an inevitable part of human existence. This is the truth of the Judeo-Christian doctrine of the fall of man. We're fallen, we're broken, we're sinners. We commit sins through our actions, and we commit sins through our emotions. That's a controversial subject. Some psychoanalysts think that we should only feel guilt in relation to harmful acts, and that we should feel no guilt for hostile, destructive thoughts and feelings. I don't agree. I certainly think that the field of action and taking responsibility for our actions and guilt around action is fundamental. But I just don't think that one can walk around with hate in one's heart and feel good about oneself. It's wrong to walk around hating. It's wrong to be full of envy and Schadenfreude and hostile, envious, greedy. We are social animals. I don't believe that morality is an entirely social construction. I believe there's a universal core to ethics. It's the simple ethic of reciprocity, fairness, justice. When our behavior is unfair and unjust and dishonest, we are going to be aware of this, and we're going to dislike ourselves and seek to punish ourselves, or if not, ward off that part of ourselves, defend against that part of ourselves that embodies conscience. Defense is against conscience. And if we can't defend against conscience, we're going to be punishing ourselves for our bad behavior, but also through our wrong feelings and impulses and fantasies. Of course, a destructive fantasy should induce far less guilt than a destructive deed. That much I certainly agree with. But I just don't think that we can ignore the fact that a certain amount of guilt is inevitable for hostile thoughts and feelings. And no human being, no matter how enlightened or saved or redeemed, is free of that kind of hostility, elements of envy, elements of greed. This is part of the fallen human condition. And therefore, a good deal of this guilt is existential and inevitable, and should not be thought of as or confused with neurotic guilt. I think a lot of, just as neurotic anxiety is often a result of the refusal to bear existential anxiety, I think a lot of neurotic guilt is tied to the refusal to bear existential guilt. Kierkegaard tells us about the inevitability of existential guilt. He points to a kind of catch-22. If I fail to develop my potentials, my talents, my potentials for growth as a human being, I'm failing myself, and I will suffer existential guilt for failing myself in these ways. On the other hand, if I do develop my potentials and I do grow as a human being, I risk growing away from or beyond others with whom I am in relationship, family members, a spouse, and they may experience my growth and development as betrayal. So now I'm guilty for growing, and if I don't grow, I'm guilty for not growing. And so here we have a type of existential guilt, part of the human condition. I'm sure we could think of many other instances of this kind of thing. I think that psychoanalysis has suffered from its failure to adequately integrate these existential insights. Kierkegaard, Martin Buber, Rollo May's The Meaning of Anxiety is an important work on anxiety, which tries to bring the existentialist perspective and to integrate it with psychoanalysis.